Okay, everyone. So thank you for joining me for week 3 of the Automatrix online training series. This week, we're going to go into a little bit more in-depth on more advanced recovery scenarios and getting more into ControlShift and how we do DR with ControlShift. And so to kick it off, we're going to start with SQL log truncation. So I'm going to go ahead and share out my screen, and we'll get that going. So as we know, as we've talked about in the previous weeks, Datrium has the ability to do a VSS quiesce of your VMs. So if you install the VSS agent on your virtual machines and you configure that virtual machine, you configure that virtual machine within the DVX plugin to utilize that VSS agent during its backups, during its protection group windows. It will do a application consistent snapshot of that VM. One thing that it will not do by default is it will not do log truncation. So there is an extra step that has to go into the log truncation. And we're going to go through that now so that you guys can see what setting that up looks like. So right here, this is a SQL VM that is running SQL 2016. It's a member of an always-on availability group. So pretty standard SQL VM. And we can see that right here, this is running the Datrium VSS agent version 1.7. So if I wanted to take a snapshot of this VM, I could take the snapshot, I could click the Use VSS button, and everything would be good. Same thing if I wanted to add this machine to a protection group and have it do a VSS snap during the protection group window, again, it would work, but it won't truncate the logs. So to do that, the first thing that we need to do is we need to log into our data node, okay? And we need to get the VM path, and we need to get the protection group ID. So to get the protection group ID, we kind of talked about this last week. We're just going to do protection groups show. And we're going to see all of our groups, and we're going to see the group ID. So in my case, I want this to be part of CTJ all VMs. And I'm going to go ahead and grab that group ID. The next thing that I need to do is I need to actually get the path to the VM according to Datrium. So to get that path, I'm just going to do VMs show. And it's going to dump all my VMs. And I'm going to find CTJ SQL 01 right here. And that's my path. Okay. So now that I have my group ID and my path, the next thing that I need to do is I need to log into this server. And I need to actually set our VSS service to be able to use a system account or a user account or a service account rather that has the VSS backup functionality within SQL. Oops. So if I look at the documentation here, it explains what permissions I need. So if you're going to set up a dedicated Datrium backup account for your SQL, whether that's a local user or you're going to do an AD user, completely up to you. But it just needs the public, the DB backup operator, and then a couple extra roles to so the DB, the deny data reader and deny data writer, and we can set those up. So if I come in here, which is the VM itself, I already have a SQL admin account that I've created. And we're just going to use that for the purposes of this demonstration. We're going to bring up services. And then we would find in the services list, we would find the DVX services, which are going to be right here. And we specifically need to find the Datrium guest agent. And you'll notice that I have this logging in as my SQL administrator account, okay? If you are setting this up from default, you would of course need to go into properties, you need to go to logon, you need to change the account from being just a local system to the service account that you specified. put in the username and the password, and then you would need to cycle the service. So you need to restart the service for it to actually log on with that service count. So once I have this done, the next thing that I can do is I can add this VM to my protection group with the correct options applied. So to do that, if we scroll down further, we can see the syntax of the command. Now, I've already prepped this, and this is what the syntax is going to look like. So it's going to be protection groups member add. So pretty standard CLI to do a member add. We're going to tell it this is the ID of the group. So that first step where we went and found the group ID, that's the group ID. Then we're going to tell it that we want to do an application consistent VM for CTJ SQL 01. And then we're going to tell it that we want to do app log truncation. So the first half of this is doable through the GUI. It's the app log truncation that you need to do through the CLI. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put that in here. And just to show you that it is adding this correctly, we're going to go back to the DVX. And we'll go to protection groups. Once it loads. So there's that. We're going to go to protection groups. And in PGs, I'm going to go ahead and find the PG that we're referring to. We're going to edit group and schedule. And you're going to see that it's all of our normal VMs. We don't have any VMs specified right now for VSS. I'm going to come back in here. I'm going to run my command. It tells me that it successfully added the members to the groups. And if I come in here and I refresh my protection groups, I see now that CTJ SQL 01 is added and it's using VSS. Okay, so that VM will now take log truncation snapshots every time. It'll take log truncation snapshots every time it does a VSS snap. So again, that's something to think about. That's going to be one extra step, one extra maintenance job that you're doing to your SQL VM every time this snap group kicks off. Now I have hourly snaps set for this, and doing hourly snaps on a SQL server where you've got VSS enabled, you're definitely going to cause some performance issues within your SQL environment, right? Because you're stunning and doing a database backup every hour. If this was a read-only secondary copy, so maybe if this was a third server in this AOAG, and it was just a read-only secondary, that'd probably be fine because nothing's really connecting to it. But since this is a primary server member, that's not something that we want to have. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this out. It would probably be better in that case if you're going to be doing log truncation for your Exchange and for your SQL, that you do those in their own protection group outside of your regular PG. So creating a new protection group, calling it maybe log truncation, and just having it run in the afternoon. Okay. So that's how we enable log truncation for SQL. The Exchange process is very similar, and again, we have steps for how to do Exchange, right? I just don't have an Exchange server built, so I can't show you that right now. But if you are still running Exchange on premise, it's a very, very similar process to enable the log truncation snaps for that. Okay. So now that we have VSS consistent backups, we have a SQL server that is, it's backing up nightly, it's doing its log truncation, it's doing all the things it needs to do. And let's say we need to do an actual SQL restore, right? Or maybe we're going to do an Exchange restore, whatever it happens to be. So again, I'm going to go to SQL 01 here, and I've got a few options for how I can do a database restore within Datrium. The caveat here is that we directly through the GUI do not have a way to do a database restore, right? We can do guest file restore, but I don't have the ability to do granular objects. So the way that I do granular objects is to use either a third-party tool or to just use the built-in Microsoft tools. So we got a couple options on how we can do this. The first is if I want to grab the MDF and LDF of that SQL database and mount them and pull the data out manually, I can do that through my guest file restore. So if I select my snapshot, it's going to go ahead and it's going to scan the virtual disks in the snapshot. It's going to find the partitions, the Windows partitions. So here they are, and I could go into my E partition, and I could grab my LDF. So this is that. You'll notice I could download it locally. If I wanted to do that, I could just download it to my local PC, or I can add it to an ISO. So we're going to add it to an ISO. Then I need to go get, so that's my MDF. I need to go get my LDF. Okay. DA snapshots. There we go. I actually did these backwards. Oops. F. Yep, that's what I need. Okay. So I got my files. And now I can create an ISO. Tell it data store 1, here's the path to the ISO. I'm going to tell it to automatically delete in 7 days. And I can go ahead and I can create these two files to a restore. Now, there are some limitations on the ISO creation. So that created pretty quickly, but let's look real quick at what the limitations are. So the first thing is the total ISO size can't be more than 10 gigs. The individual files can't be more than 4 gigs. If I'm going to download a file, it's got to be 2 gigs max. If a virtual disk is more than 2 terabytes, we can't mount it. And then, of course, we've got some path and some volume limitations as well. So great if you've got a small server, but what if I've got a big server, right? Or what if my database is hundreds of gigs instead of tens of gigs? Well, restoring via an ISO is not going to work for you. So how do we get around that? Well, in that case, what we would do is we would click on the protection tab here. We would find the snapshot that we want to use. So let's say we're going to use our hour ago snapshot. And then I'd be able to click on snapshot actions. And I would tell it I want to use the virtual disks in the snapshot. In this case, I want to do the .1 VMDK. We're going to clone it out. Yes, there. And of course, it's telling me that I've already got one of these because when I was practicing this earlier, forgot to delete it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clone my 2 disks. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mount those disks to the VM. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it, whoops, I don't want a new hard disk. I want an existing hard disk. I'm going to go find that in the data store. SQL 01. There's my 01 clone. My 01 VMDK. And then I'm going to do, again, whoops, not a network adapter. I'm going to do existing hard disk. Do the same thing. SQL 01. That's my second disk clone. There's that. We're going to hit OK. It's going to mount those. And then I'm going to go back over to my VM here. And then I'm going to go ahead and go to disk management. I'm going to mount these volumes as online. Okay, and now my disks are available, right? So I would be able to, in here, now I can see my new, let me get F, G, and where is, oops, that did not work the way that I wanted it to. I'm going to change the drive letter and path on that to H. Online this again. There we go. That should be fine. There we go. That's what I want now. Set that back to F. There we go. All right, that's what I want. So I've got my G and H drives. These are my restored disks, and then I've got my E and F drives. Those are my production disks. So I have a couple different ways that I could restore this, right? We could use SQL Server Recovery Studio to just come in here and actually mount the databases, right? So we could come in, we could mount the database that way. That's one option. Another option is if you have things like curl on track, or if you have Veeam Explorer, you would have the ability to tell it, hey, I want to add a database. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add my DA Snapshots database. And then we're going to go ahead and tell it that the logs do actually exist. And they're right there. And now I have my database, I have my correct log path, and now I could either do a restore database directly into my SQL server, or I could go ahead and I could do a schema export, or if I wanted to, I could do any other number of operations with this tool. The great thing, and I'm going to go ahead and stop it. So kind of ups and downsides, right? So the upside is if you guys are using third-party tools already to take backups of your SQL database, your Exchange databases, and you want a secondary way to be able to recover data, this is a really great way to do it. The second thing is Veeam Explorer is part of Veeam Community Edition. So it's not necessarily something, obviously, if you're doing large scale recovery, if you're doing a lot of stuff, if you're doing multiple databases, there are some limitations on what Veeam Explorer can do with the Community Edition. But again, it gives you that way to not have to use SQL Server Management Studio to do backups and restores. And use instead our snapshots, right? And then of course I've got my database files, and so I could do really whatever I want to do with these database files. It's kind of up to me. So when we talk about doing application level restores, right, we are still needing to use some other tools to be able to restore that data. But the idea is that because we can very rapidly mount that data to the VM, and because if we were to mess this data up at all, right? So if we mess up these drives, who cares? I can delete them and I can just reclone them from that point in time. It doesn't take any space. It doesn't take any time. It makes it very easy for you, right? And then of course, the other thing about cloning those drives out is I can always attach these drives wherever I want. So very much like I can attach my ISOs wherever I want, I can always attach these drives wherever I want. So if that's a development SQL server, maybe, that gives me a really quick way to say, okay, I could clone from my production SQL server, right? So I could, I'm not going to clone the VM from the snapshot. I'm going to clone the disk from the snapshot. So I could clone these disks from the snapshot, and I could attach these disks directly to like a dev box, have the developers, refresh their database. So basically drop the database and then reload it. It'll reload from the latest snapshot data. And they can basically have a very, very fast way to refresh their dev environment that does not involve doing a full restore. So just a few things to think through there, right? For functionality in the VOS. So adding functionality to be able to do database restores directly through the GUI or directly through directly through the guest restore is something that we are looking to do in the future. We actually have a lot of the groundwork built for it. And right now, most things are just on hold while we flesh out the DRC and DR as a service products. So as many of you may have seen on Wednesday, we announced for general availability the DR Connect product. So there's been a lot of internal development has been put on hold while we focused on getting that launched. So yes, we do plan to add some enhancements to this, but for right now, realistically, probably for about the next 12 months, this is what we're going to do. Okay. Okay, so now that we've looked a little bit at what we can do in terms of a database restore or an individual file restore, and actually real quick before we kind of move away from that, I want to actually mount that ISO so I can show you what the ISO looks like if you were to do an ISO-based restore. So there's the ISO. We're going to connect it. I can come back in here, and now I have my individual files. I've got the recovered file, and then I've got the README that explains where we got the file from. Okay. So recovered files to an ISO show up like this, and then of course you can always attach your disks. Something that I like to use the disk attach for is also in the case of a DFS server. So again, this is a Microsoft DFS box, just a 2019 server with the DFSR role installed on it. And if I were to get hit by ransomware on this box, I may not have to, let's log in. Depending on how I have my shares built, I may not have to recover the whole server, right? I may only recover, oops, get rid of this. Oops. I'll bring this up. So because on this box, right, I have my shares are on a different drive. And in fact, within that drive, I've got a bunch of different individual shares. So if I just needed to restore an individual share here, it'll probably be bigger than what I can do with the ISO share. But again, I don't need to roll back the whole VM. So in this case, again, I could come into the DVX recovery. I could clone out the VMDK that has the shares that are affected on it. I could mount that VMDK, and then I got a couple options, right? I could actually change the drive path to say, okay, this VMDK, basically the recovered VMDK is now the live shares, and everybody's pointed at that. That way I don't have to go update data or move data or anything like that. So again, if I come into protection, find it and tell it, okay, I want to do the VMDK restore. So I got a bunch of VMDKs here that I could choose to restore. So I could, oops, I don't want that one. I want this one. So I could do the VMDK restore, right? And I could point, I could just repoint it. So basically say, yeah, okay, this E disk, I'm going to give that a new drive letter. I'm going to give the restored disk the E drive, and now all my shares will update and will point to that. Everybody's back up and running. Or if I wanted to be very methodical, I could start doing like a robocopy or an Xcopy script to do a compare and basically say that anything that's been modified in the time of the attack, use the copy from the restored drive, right? So it gives me a few different ways that I can do that. But a second kind of cool thing that we can do is in DFSR, one of the biggest problems that you usually have setting DFSR up is that initial sync. Usually if you just dump all your data into a single server, you set up a secondary server and then you tell it to sync, in most cases, it'll fail that initial sync. It never catches up and you end up having to manually move the data. So one thing that I always did when I was setting up file servers at Altair, and then now when I help customers set up new file servers in their Datrium environments, is we'll get everything moved onto the first new file server, and then we'll clone the VMDK that has all the data on it. So we'll clone it out just like we did for the SQL boxes. And then instead of having it attach to the, instead of having it attached to O1, we'd come over to the O2 server. We would attach the cloned VMDK to the O2 server and then tell DFS, okay, cool, now you can start your replication topology. DFS is going to do its initial compare, and it's going to say, oh, yeah, data is exactly the same in both locations. I'm just going to start syncing my changes, right? So it's a really quick, easy way to do things like a DFS hydration, again, so long as both VMs are within the same Datrium system. In fact, even if they're not in the same Datrium system, an option that I would have there is I could actually go into my DVX and I could go to files. So again, I've said in the past, files is not something you use frequently, but this is a case in which files actually make sense to use. And if DFS02 here was maybe at a remote site instead of a local site, but I didn't want to do a manual copy of all that data, I wanted to use Datrium's replication to be able to move that over. What I could do is I could come into files here, and I could go to data store 1, and I can find CTJ DFS01 here, and then I could find all my files. So in this case, right, the the VMDK and the flat, and I could take these and I could actually replicate these files. So I could take a snapshot of this file and I could replicate it to a secondary site, right? So I have that ability to replicate this directly across to another site and then restore the file at that other site, attach it to CTJ DFS02, and I'd have my VM hydrated over at the secondary site. So again, another way that you could use the replication, which you would be using for DR, but using that replication at a secondary site to hydrate a DFSR or any other file server that you wanted to replicate, hydrating that. Okay, so those are just, again, some kind of more advanced, restores that we can do locally or cross-site. One last thing I want to show here is the ability to take a VM that's been replicated to the cloud and do a guest file restore directly from the cloud. So I'm going to go to protection groups. I'm going to find a group that's being replicated out to AWS. So I'm going to take this Boris PG. Boris is actually one of our founders. So I'm going to borrow his protection group. And you'll see that I've got prod DVX, and then I've also got my AWS here. So I'm going to tell it that I only want to look at, snapshots from the remote site. So I'm going to do show remote snapshots. And I can see where the location is. So right now on all these, I can see that they're both in prod DVX and AWS. And if I wanted to pull something from AWS, I'd have the ability to come in here. I'm going to grab this snapshot. I want to tell it that I want to look at the AWS version, and I want to retrieve it, right? Now, because the data is already local, I don't need to pull the data. But if the data was only in AWS, right, I would be able to retrieve the snapshot. So I'd be able to tell it I want to retrieve this back to on-prem, or I want to be able to restore data directly out of it. So again, all snapshot options, I could do a restore guest file directly from the cloud, or if I just needed to pull an individual VM file, I'd be able to pull an individual VM file from that remote location, right? So again, we've got it in both places. We don't need to retrieve it, but if this were only in the cloud, I'd be able to directly restore guest files from the cloud, or I could ask it to just pull the whole snapshot back on-prem and recover my files that way, or whole VM or whatever it is I need to do. So it gives me, again, it gives me that option where if I have a protection group where maybe I'm only holding 30 days of data on-prem and everything older than 30 days I'm pushing to the cloud, right? Which we could do very easily. So if I edited a group and schedule here, and I came here, so we've got 30 days worth of snapshots here. Let's say I create a monthly. I'm gonna create a monthly first of the month, and I'm gonna hold it for 4 months, right? Well, except on-prem, I'm gonna hold this for 1 day. Oops, not Q days. I'm gonna hold it for 1 day. And then I'm gonna replicate that snapshot out to the cloud. And I'm gonna hold that for 6 months, let's say. So now this monthly snapshot basically is staying on premise long enough to complete the replication out to the cloud. And then we're holding it in the cloud for 6 months. So basically we're just taking all of our rolled up chain to our monthly point here, and then we're pushing that month out to the cloud and we're keeping it out in the cloud for 6 months. That way you're not wasting your on-premise data with old snapshots, right? You can just push those out to the cloud, have them tier out there, and then when you need them, you can pull them back on premise, or you can just browse for the data that you might need in the cloud without having to worry about any egress, right? So it makes it pretty easy for you, regardless of where you're pushing or pulling data from. Okay. So now that we've talked about a lot of recovery options on-prem, let's talk about some considerations with ControlShift and the DR policies associated with ControlShift, right? And really the big reason why I wanted to talk about this is I kind of want to highlight, or I should say I want to compare and contrast against SRM. A lot of people use SRM, a lot of people use Zerto. They're very comfortable with it, they're very familiar with it. But of course, you know, having ControlShift being something that you can use on your own, and have it be integrated into the DVX stack can be pretty nice. So the first thing that I want to show you is that right now you'll notice this is an internal IP, and this is because we're accessing this ControlShift via the data node internally. So we're using the data node as a proxy to get to this ControlShift. There we go, 50, oops. If I go directly to the external IP, and it actually logs me in. Let me go here. And if I do 50, oh, hold on one second, because I have credentials saved, just not there. There we go. Okay. So this is logging me in because I've got my credentials saved. But again, as you noticed, if I go in an incognito window, whoops. If I go to an incognito window, it is actually asking for a username and a password. So it's, in this case, it's asking for an email address and a password. We actually use Amazon's Cognito service as the front end for this. So whether you want to use just basic named users via email and password, or you want to tie this in with your Okta or your 80 Federation or whatever other single sign-on service you like, or even two-factor authentication like Duo, as long as it is supported by Amazon Cognito, we can support it. So again, this is, you'll notice this is, with us, it's got an actual URL here, and then it's not just sitting out on the internet, which is pretty great. Okay, but within ControlShift, I got a couple options, right? I can do site-to-site recovery plans. I can also do site to cloud recovery plans. Yes, I know that that's not working the way I want it to. I can also do a site to cloud recovery plan, right? So whether I'm going site to site or site to cloud, everything is the same, because at the end of the day, this is the cloud side, right? This is VMware's SDDC. You'll notice that we're running a single host cluster in SDDC, but it is the same vCenter that you're used to. It is the same VMware that you're used to. All these things work the way that you expect them to. And so when you're failing out into the cloud, this was kind of why we partnered with AWS to do DR as a service, was because we wanted to make it super easy for you guys. The other thing that you'll notice is that I have my data stores, oops, not the local ones, but I have my data stores that are both local to the SDDC cluster, but I also have data stores from Datrium. So it says DS01, 02, and 03. So if I actually look at the files in these, I have the same options for all three of these data stores, right? I have the same options that I would have in my on-prem to be able to do VM restores as I do, I'm gonna close this anyway, as I do in my SDDC. So whether I'm using Datrium on-prem or Datrium in the cloud, I have all the same, whoops. I have all the same options. So let's go back here. And let's go to ControlShift. There we go. Let's go back to ControlShift. All right, cool. And now we're going to go to DR. And this will actually load this time because my session's authenticated this time, which is awesome. So as we are planning a failover, okay, so you see I've got a bunch of plans here. As we're planning a failover, so I'm going to create a new plan. And we're going to have this be site to site. So as we're planning this, we got a few things that we need to take into account, right? So we've got our protected site, which is going to be prod DVX, our failover site, which is going to be our DVX, and then we've got a couple options on what we can do for backup site and test site. Backup site is basically, hey, where else are these backups stored? So that if the backup is not at the DR site, maybe if there is a newer backup somewhere else, where else might those backups be? And in this case, I could point it at Cloud DVX to say, hey, check there as well for some of my backups. The other thing that I've got here is a test site. So a test site allows me to look at maybe another site or another resource pool if I want to specify something that is not my actual production failover site. So maybe if I've got like a test cluster or something like that, I could specify that as my test site so that I can test things without actually going to failover. The next thing that we need to do is we need to select our protection groups. Now, the protection groups that we select for this can be multiple, right? So it's not one group per plan. So if I've got maybe my DR group here, so it's got my DR VMs in it, and then maybe I had another group that had all my SQL VMs that were doing their log truncation, maybe I could select both of those, right? So in this case, I'm just going to select CTJ DR. I'm going to move on. Failover mappings, again, these are pretty similar, these are pretty standard, and this is again why I mentioned that usually at my DR sites, I will have a secondary data store for failover. And it's just so that whenever I recover VMs for a failover, whether that's a test or that's an actual failover, I always like to do it into another data store so that the data store one at both sites is always kind of my production running workload. Those are supposed to be the servers that are running at that site. And then I'll create a secondary data store called, usually something like DR data store or DR test or something like that. In this case, we've called it prod 2 at the secondary site, so that's what we're going to use. You'll also notice that on each of these tabs, you're going to see a same for failover and test, right? So if I have a test, I could specify an even different data store and have it mapped there. Next thing is going to be vCenter mappings, right? So this is going to be the source and the destination vCenters. Our best practice is we would like these to be separate. Unless you're doing vCenter high availability, we would like you to have a separate vCenter at each site. The reason being is that we utilize the VMware APIs within vCenter to do the machine registrations. So I can do all of my recoveries without vCenter being up, but I need my vCenter to be up for those machines, for those machines to actually register themselves and run. So that is why we want to have separate vCenters, or if you're doing HA vCenter where it's going to point at the same instance, but you've got an HA instance at each of your sites, that's fine. But again, as you're planning, how you build your secondary site, it does make a lot of sense to deploy a secondary vCenter there, at least from a Datrium perspective. And then you've got your folder mappings. So again, these are just, hey, the VMs live in certain folders, and where do we want them to live? You'll also notice that these folders, the ones that we specifically need, we don't need to map everything. We just need to map the ones that are showing up in blue. So in this case, it's going to be my SQL VM. So I'm going to point it at the SQL folder. And then I've got my file servers, and I'm going to do the same thing. So I've got matching at each side. And then same thing, I could specify different for test if I want. And again, you'll notice if I uncheck for one, it doesn't uncheck for all. So just because I may want different test folders, or maybe I want different test data stores, but in the same folders, it's not a policy-wide setting, right? Okay. The next thing is going to be compute resources, pretty self-explanatory. Production cluster at one site, the DR cluster at the other site. And again, you'll notice as we go down each of these, as it validates, it's giving you a green check, right? So if I put something in here, where if I put virtual networks, I'm going to do ctj.lan, and I'm going to go ctj private. And if that's not a good one to show. I'll go back to vCenters. I'll show it like this. Show all. Oops, it's not going to let me do it. Okay. But if I put in a, actually we could do it like this. I can show it to you like this. Beautiful. Okay. So if I move on from a step, so vCenter folders, right? It's saying, hey, it's missing a mapping here. It needs it. It'll move on because it'll say, well, I've got some of the configuration in there, and I guess depending on what you put in for recovery steps, this might work, but hey, just be aware that you're missing a folder, right? So then we could come back in here, DFS, and once again, it's happy, okay? Now, when we talk about IP addresses for failover mappings, this is really cool because we modify either the Windows registry or we modify the Linux etc interfaces files before your VMs come online. Which is really cool, so that when they come online at the remote site, they come up with the right IP address. If we're not able to do that for whatever reason, once the VM's online, we use VMware tools to do the upgrade. So like if you're using an LVM, or maybe you're using BitLocker on your Windows VMs, and we can't read the registry while it's cold, we'd be able to then use VMware tools once it's online to do the IP address update. But again, I can do either the first 3 octets, change the first 3 octets, change the protection, or sorry, the gateways, the DNS servers, right? Or if for whatever reason, if I just need to do a static one-to-one mapping, maybe at my DR site, I've got multiple things in the same VLANs, and just changing octets is going to create some overlap. I could do static one-to-one mappings, and they work here. Okay, couple things on this right now that you need to be aware of. One is that if you have a machine that has both static and DHCP interfaces on it, this will fail, right? Basically, the pre-check for this will say, I don't have a rule for the DHCP, And therefore I can't modify the network because I can't modify all the interfaces. So just be aware of that. If you have a VM that for whatever reason has a static interface and it's got a DHCP interface, that can cause problems. We've also found in a couple instances where if you have VMs that have IPv6 set to DHCP or set to self-assigned IPs, and you only have IPv4 rules in here, those are also things that have caused pre-checks or have caused some checks to fail. So just be aware of making sure that all of your networks on your VMs are matching up what you have rule sets in here for. Now, that being said, if you are someone who is using stretch LANs, VXLAN, VTEP, NSX, ACI, any kind of advanced software-defined networking, or even just saying, hey, we just stretched some fiber between two data centers and we're doing a stretch LAN like that, you might not need any of the IP rules. And that's totally fine. If you leave these blank, we'll just say, hey, we're going to ignore all IP addressing and we're going to move on. Okay. The virtual networks are the same thing, right? So if I have two standard switches, or even if I have virtual distributed switches that are different at each site, I do need to map them. If I've got VDSs that are the same, it will pick up on that and just say, hey, it's the same switch, so we don't need to worry about that. Okay, script VM. So we talked about this a little bit in a previous training, but again, this is going to be a VM that is going to be able to be available in the secondary site to run your scripts. In this case, I have a VM called CTJ util here. That is where all my scripts are. Oops, go back here. And I would tell it that, this is where it is in the prod site. And then I'd tell it, hey, I want to use the same settings for failover and test. And now when I actually do recovery steps, I can create a script step. So if I create an other step and I want to tell it to run a script off the script VM, now I can go ahead and I can pass these. One of the things that we usually recommend is that for customers that are doing the on-demand for the SDDC, where this is not running all the time, this is down until you're ready for it to come online. One of the things that we usually recommend is that you have a standalone policy that if you're going to use a script VM, you have a standalone policy that the only action is that it recovers the scripts VM. So that's it. It just says, hey, all the normal mappings, and then under recovery steps, it's just power on my scripts VM. And then once that's complete, then you have your regular DR plan that actually runs everything, but now your scripts VM is online at the remote site. That's also useful for if you do have an existing VM today that you use at your prod site. Maybe you do have a lot of automation in your existing environment and you have a utility server or an enterprise scheduler or a worker VM or something like that that runs all your scripts. Again, same thing. If you don't want to have copies of that at your secondary site, you can always shut you can always have a standalone recovery plan for that, right? And then of course, with my recovery steps, I have the ability, to say, okay, the first thing I want to do obviously is I want to recover the protection group, right? So I need to recover all these VMs, and I'm not going to power on any of them. All I'm going to do is I'm going to recover them and I'm going to register them. And then once I recover and register them, then the next thing that I can do is I can actually tell it, okay, power on these individual VMs. So I want the DFS box up first. I do want to power it on. And then I've got pre and post actions. Now I got a couple things. I can wait for IP address or I can wait for VMware tools. Personally, I like to wait for the IP address just because it confirms that the network is working. I can set a timeout for that, which is awesome. And then I could also set a script. So basically I could say, hey, wait for the IP address. And then once you've got the IP address, then go ahead and run a PowerShell script. And my PowerShell script could be, doing service checks. It could be doing a login. It could be doing a lot of things. The one caveat to this is that any arguments you pass need to be through this configuration, and there is no way to interact with a script. So if you need to pass, credentials, if you need any kind of responses to questions, this is not interactive. This is a set and forget. So just be aware that as you're creating your scripts, as you're creating your automation, they do need to be scripts that do not need user interaction. Okay. I can also create a step under other steps. I can also create a step that's wait for user input. So you can prompt to say, maybe I can stop and say, hey, go log into the SQL server and make sure it works. So if I didn't want to create a PowerShell script to automate that, I could just tell the user, hey, go log in, check that it works. That user would then respond and say, yep, it works. And then we'd move on to our next step, right? So a couple different ways, depending on kind of your level of ability, that you can interact with your recovery jobs. Okay. And then, of course, the next thing to do is to set up your alerts and your alert triggers. These email recipients are different than your on-premise DVX. So you do need to set these up individually. And we use an AWS simple mail service to send these out. So again, it's a little bit different than what you guys have set up on-prem. But again, it does give you the ability to select what emails are getting what alerts, right? So once I have this all configured, if I'm going prem to prem, that's super easy, right? All I would need to do is I go find it. I notice that my continuous compliance check has come back green. If I wanted to update that real quick, I could check here and tell it, go ahead and update this continuous compliance. Basically, we're looking at 17 functions at each site, and we do it every 30 minutes, right? So once I check continuous compliance, it comes back green. I could check either test failover, or I could do a production failover. But maybe if I'm in a situation where I don't have cloud, or I don't have a secondary site and I need to bring up a cloud, that's where this Failover SDDC tab comes into play. And in this case, we have one launched, but if you didn't have one launched, all you would need to do is click the button that says Launch SDDC. It'll give you a status. It'll launch and configure all of this for you. And then through here, you have all of your networks, you have your IP addresses, your NAT rules, and you've got your firewall as well. So you've got your networks, your IPs, everything you would need. And then if I need to add hosts, I can tell it how many hosts I want, and then I can just tell it, go ahead and add a host, right? And it will automatically add another ESX host to this cluster. It'll expand the cluster resources. It'll rebalance the cluster. It'll do all the things it needs to do. And as we grow that out, as we grow that out further, you have that ability to continuously rebalance. And then you've also got the ability to remove hosts. So if you need to scale things down while you're running a DR, you can do that as well. And when you're done running your DR test or your actual DR, you of course have the ability to come in here and delete it, right? So once you're done running it, stop paying for it and delete it, right? So this is all handled through ControlShift. We don't make you touch the Amazon, the VMware SDDC control panel at all. This is all handled through us. The biggest thing that is not included in any of this that you really need to consider is once you're in SDDC, how are we going to get users into SDDC? Now you'll notice that I've got the NSX Edge appliance here, right? And this is part of just the standard bring up of the SDDC. So this makes it very easy for us to create IPsec tunnels between sites. So just standard L2TP over IPsec, but NSX Edge does not support client-based VPN. So if you want people connecting to this via a client-based VPN, you would need to throw up either like an open VPN server, a Sophos, a FortiGate, Meraki's got a virtual VPN server, right? So you would need to have your own virtual VPN appliance that you could run, or you need to have an existing AWS service So again, same thing, having a virtual cloud-based VPN endpoint that can talk into your SDDC. So as you're thinking through how you would fail over into a secondary site, obviously we have a lot of great things that we can do from a disaster recovery perspective to streamline everything, but you do need to be very cognizant of how we can get the data over there very, very easily, but how are you going to get your users in there, okay? So that's what I've got for you guys today. Got 3 minutes left in the hour, so I really appreciate you guys hanging in there with me and talking about some more advanced failover and DR. Next week, we're going to talk about scaling considerations. So as you're looking at maybe purchasing new hosts for your cluster, maybe building a secondary cluster, adding and removing data nodes, all of that good stuff. So we're going to go back to a little bit more daily administration than we are DR and backup planning. But with that, I'm gonna open up the floor to questions. Okay, well, it looks like we kind of covered everything, and no one's got any great questions. So again, thank you guys for joining. And as soon as this is posted to YouTube, I will send out the links. And have a great day.